This is the third Sunday in Lent, and this Sunday we're looking at the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman by the well. Now, there's a lot of background and history and meaning in that meeting between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. The Jews, the Judeans, and the Samaritans hated each other, and there was a long history of that. Um, the Samaritans saw themselves as inheritors of the same tradition, but they thought they were doing it right, much like the Judeans thought they were doing it right. And there was this real kind of battle. When the Assyrians had taken over the 10 northern tribes, the land of Israel, they exiled the vast majority of the people. Some of them got into Judah as refugees and to be protected, but a great many of them were removed. And as was the Assyrian manner at the time, they brought in other nations, other nationalities of people to populate the land. That was part of how Assyria made sure their land, the people in the land were dedicated to them and not looking for ways to rebel. So those newcomers, plus the Israelites that remained, because there were some, intermarried after a while. And that is the origin of the people of the Samaritan tradition. They're still biologically, ethnically connected to the people in Judea, but neither the Samaritans or the Judeans wanted to acknowledge that. Then, when the Babylonian exile happened, um, the first temple was destroyed. Now, archaeologically, we cannot be sure where the first temple was because the tradition is that it was in Jerusalem, and there's no reason to not believe that. But the Samaritan tradition was that it was on Mount Gerizim, their mountain where Jacob's well was. So this squabble happened, kind of nullified when the Babylonian exile took place. But when the Babylonians came back with the benefit of the Persians, they built the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Eventually, there was a period of time, the Hasmonean Empire, where there was an actual inheritor of Judaism, I will say, or the Hebrew tradition on the throne in Jerusalem. And he waged war against the Samaritans and in one of the raids destroyed the temple that was on Mount Gerizim. So there was no love lost between these people. And that happened around 150 BCE. So about 150 years before Jesus is born, 175 years, roughly 180 years before Jesus is doing his ministry. So that's some of the history between the Samaritans and the Judeans and why there is so much animosity. As for the Galilean that Jesus was, he lived in the land above Samaria. So in order to get back and forth to Judea, the shortest way was through the Samaritan territory. And the Samaritans didn't know the difference, really, between those who identified as Galilean and those who were Judean. So there was a great deal of hostility. And if you look at the Gospel of John, John moves back and forth between Judah and Galilee. One story will happen in one place, and then he's traveling to another place. There's a real kind of flow going on to the stories, and he would have traveled back and forth through Samaritan territory. So this is the first time he actually stops, according to the Gospel of John. And then he goes to this woman and says, "Can I have a drink?" And she's surprised. Now, there's been a lot of cultural read-ins, inaccurate read-ins of this woman. She's been slammed for well over 1,000, almost 2,000 years as being a woman of lesser repute, of why is she in the middle of the day out there while the other women are in the evening, all sorts of stuff that doesn't work with what we know now about the culture of the day. But assumptions and the misogyny of our church kind of follows through. So she's always put in a particular place of being a not nice person, being someone who is sexually immoral. There is absolutely nothing in the story to suggest that is an actual reading. In fact, what we do have in the story is that she is a highly respected woman in her community because when she speaks, they listen and the people come back to see Jesus afterwards. So getting back to the encounter, Jesus comes up and asks her for water. Now, first of all, while men and women talked, it wasn't a normal thing. So for a man alone and a woman alone to have a conversation at the well was a little unusual. And she noted that as being unusual. And then she also says, "But you're a Judean. Why would you have anything to do with me?" Jesus doesn't correct her. But he talks about something that might appeal to her. he talks about asking. He first of all he asks for a drink of water, and she says, "Well, how are you going to get one? Because the well's deep and you don't have the bucket." And he asks her to get him one, so she does. And they sit and talking, and Jesus talks to her about living water. Now, we always hear about living water and wonder where how it fits in. What's the significance in the story? What does it even mean, really? While I was preparing the sermon today, I watched my teenage son go by, and he had 2 glasses of water, and he washed some dishes, and he emptied a pot that had been on the stove, and he filled it again, and he went to the bathroom, and he had a shower. We take water for granted. Now imagine a woman in the desert where the only water they get has to be carefully preserved, and you have to go to the town well to actually pull it. Water would have been a commodity for her that is just lost on those of us, particularly in Canada, where we've got more fresh water than anywhere in the world. In this desert climate, in this place where you couldn't necessarily guarantee that you would have the moisture and the water you needed, Jesus offers her living water, or the better translation is flowing water. And she's intrigued. She wants to know what this is. And he tries to explain how it nourishes the soul. It's not just something physical. She, like Nicodemus, made the mistake of hearing Jesus literally. And quite frankly, a lot of us make that mistake with a lot of the Christian passages and teachings over the years. And Jesus says, no, I'm not talking about physical water. I'm talking about something bigger, something spiritual that quenches you and never goes away, and you are fulfilled. And this conversation goes on, and he identifies himself eventually as the Messiah to her, and that's who she is prepared for. That's who they're all prepared for. But this concept of the Messiah as water is very rare, very odd to her. But something in it keeps her intrigued. And eventually Jesus starts to say, well, why don't you bring your husband and we can talk about this? And she says, I don't have a husband. And he says, no, I know, you've had 5, and now the person you're living with isn't your husband. That's kind of the part where people let the misogyny and assume that this woman has no sexual morals. There's many reasons why that could have been the case, not the least of which is people die, and women needed to be taken care of. So she doesn't have one, and Jesus says, no, I know. And then it continues. It's not an issue for Jesus. It's identified and moved on. But that encounter is enough to solidify for her that there's something here. You are a prophet. You know what's going on. And prophets were not people who predicted the future. Prophets are people just expounding on things that were mattering, that were teaching about the lessons of God, what the world needs to have. So she went into town and she told people, you got to come see this guy. He actually knows things about me that I didn't know and he could possibly know. There's something here. You've got to be part of this. In the meantime, the disciples have come. They were surprised that he was talking to a woman, but if they thought anything, they didn't say anything about it. She leaves and they ask, have you eaten? And Jesus says, no, I haven't eaten. But I don't have to because I'm full of of bread of God. And the disciples, again, kind of like Nicodemus, kind of like the Samaritan woman, read this literally. Like, where have you eaten? There's nothing here that shows that you have. And then Jesus goes to talk about the harvest. And again, probably confusing his followers. And he says, the harvest is all around. We don't have to wait 4 months till the season is right. We get to look now. It's everywhere. That someone else has often done the planting, and it's your turn to do the harvesting. Or you'll do the planting and someone else will do the harvesting. In this passage, although Jesus is very confusing and there's a whole lot of things to grapple with, and people will go absolutely berserk with trying to find the symbolic meaning of everything, Jesus is, again, talking much like he talked with Nicodemus about being born anew, being born again. Simple, everyday, living things that everybody experiences in a new frame of reference, a new perspective, a new look, a new outlook. Living water for this woman who does not guarantee that there's going to be enough water for every day. Living water is something that means life continuing, kind of like the everlasting life that we read in John 3:16 last week. It is a continuation of whatever fills our soul, gives us that quenches that thirst in our soul, that we will continue on, that God is a never-ending source of that joy and that nourishment, that water, that thing that satiates us. It's constant, and all we have to do is look and ask. As for the harvest is all around. Jesus sat by a well talking to a woman who now goes and gets her friends and the other people in the town and brings them back. Jesus is giving an example to his followers of what harvest looks like. When you sit with people, when you talk with people, when you find folks who are just hungry or desperate or confused or just interested in something else, there's the potential harvest. Now, we're talking evangelism here. And the problem with so much evangelism right now, first of all, that word has been co-opted, which is one of the reasons I want to reclaim it. And that's why this place is called Barefoot Evangelist. But evangelism is simply talking to people and showing them there's a different way of doing life. There's a different way of prioritizing your values. It is not about going out and bombarding people and beating them over the head and threatening them and telling them they're going to hell if they don't follow, because none of that is Christian belief anyway. It's hogwash and control. When Jesus talks about harvesting, it's essentially look around you. The world is full of hurting and broken people. All they want to hear is that they're being given an opportunity, that following God, not necessarily being part of the Christian church, and I really want to draw that distinction, following the teachings of Jesus is life-changing. Like with Nicodemus last week, the being born anew, becoming a new person. Now we've got the metaphor of living water. This constant moisture that is quenching our soul is possible with faith in Jesus. Addresses his apostles, though, the followers. It's your job to do some of this harvesting, to look to find out who are the broken people who might need a kind word, who might need something to look forward to, who might need hope, who might want to understand, who might have heard two or three things about the faith that is wrong and they need to have that corrected. Who are these people? Go find them, because they really are everywhere. There's never an opportunity not to have a positive conversation about the life that God asks us to be part of. And that life is the co-creating. Going right back to John 3:16 last week, that God loved the world. There are so many hurting people out there, and they just want to know that they matter. And it's the most basic Christian message that we can give them, that you matter, that God cared so much to come down for your sake. It's a radical concept. It might not necessarily be easy, especially in the world we have where there's so many assumptions about what Christ's followers are. And a lot of them are negative, and those negative assumptions are mostly wrong. But the way people have learned about Jesus throughout history is to watch people living that faith. That's how we do the harvest, or whatever language we want to. And it's not like a to-do list where we check off how many people we've convinced this week. It's just opening the door, showing people that there's something wonderful here, something more, something never-ending, nourishing, changing their lives, telling them it matters. That's what we're asked to do. The Samaritan woman, she got that message, went and told her friends, and they came back and they said, you know what? We've met him now. Thank you. You don't need to do this work anymore. It's now for us to do our own work. That's where we can be. After we set it in motion, the love of God really does develop through kindness, through word of mouth, through encouragement, through telling people they matter. It's essential, no matter how long the readings are that we're going to be doing with John through Lent, and they're pretty long and they're pretty common. But the message is going to be continuously, God is with you. No matter how dark it gets, God is there.